Every empire has faced the same enemy. The Dutch guilder did. The British pound did. The Roman denarius did. There is always a successor. There is always a collapse. The only question left, is yours next? I used to believe the dollar was different. I thought our currency carried some permanent authority, something earned through economic dominance, something protected by institutions too powerful to fail. I held this belief for decades. Most of us did. It felt obvious, like gravity, like the way things simply worked. Questioning it seemed paranoid, extreme, the territory of conspiracy theorists. I never questioned it. That was my first mistake. Then I started looking at the pattern, not just American history, deeper, older. I traced what happened to every dominant currency before ours: the Portuguese real, the Spanish dollar, the Dutch guilder, the British pound. I tracked each timeline from dominance to decline, and I found something I could not unsee. Every single one collapsed. Every population that held those currencies paid a price they never saw coming. The pattern does not have exceptions. It never has. How much of your retirement account is denominated in dollars? The Dutch guilder dominated global trade for nearly 80 years. Amsterdam was the financial center of the world. Dutch banks set interest rates that rippled across continents. Merchants from every nation held guilders because they had to. The currency seemed permanent. It was not. The guilder's decline began slowly, then all at once. The Dutch population watched their purchasing power evaporate within a generation. The British pound held reserve currency status for over 100 years. The sun never set on British currency. Sterling financed the Industrial Revolution. It funded wars, it built empires, and then it fell. Not because Britain lost a war, not because of a single crisis. It fell because the structure underneath it decayed. The debt exceeded what the economy could support. Trust eroded, slowly, then completely. What did this mean for ordinary British citizens? It meant their savings purchased less every year. It meant their pensions lost value faster than they could adjust. It meant the wealth they thought they had built was quietly transferred to those holding the rising currency. They did not choose this. They did not vote for it. They simply woke up poorer than they went to sleep. When was the last time you considered what your savings would be worth if the dollar lost 40% of its purchasing power in a decade? In 1944, the dollar became the global reserve currency. This was not an accident. It was architecture. At Bretton Woods, 44 nations agreed to peg their currencies to the dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold. This gave America an extraordinary privilege: the ability to print the money the world needed to hold. It seemed like a permanent advantage. It was actually a structural time bomb. Today, the dollar represents approximately 59% of global foreign exchange reserves. That sounds dominant, but in 2000, it was over 70%. 11 points of decline in 2 decades. The trajectory is not theoretical. It is measured. It is ongoing. Every year, central banks around the world hold slightly fewer dollars. They are not making announcements. They are making quiet decisions, the kind that precede loud consequences. Reserve currency status requires global trust. Trust in the issuing nation's debt. Trust that the currency will hold its value. Trust that the system will remain stable. But here is the trap. To supply the world with reserve currency, you must run deficits. You must accumulate debt. And when that debt exceeds productive capacity, the trust erodes, not because of policy failure, because of structural mathematics. Do you know which currency replaced the British pound as the global reserve? The answer is the dollar. Yours. The one you hold right now. The one measuring everything you own. And just as the pound fell into the dollar's shadow, the dollar will fall into something else's. I watch the same financial channels you watch. I hear the same reassurances. Experts explaining why this time is different, why our debt is sustainable, why our institutions are stronger. I heard the same arguments from British economists in the 1940s. The words were different. The confidence was identical. The outcome was not. I did not want to believe this. The evidence did not ask for my belief. The pattern repeated across 5 centuries. Every reserve currency, every empire, every population that assumed permanence. The question was never if this would happen to the dollar. The question was when, and what mechanism would drive it. That mechanism has a name. I had never heard of it until I saw the architecture, the Triffin dilemma, the trap built into the foundation, the mathematical certainty hidden in plain sight. The Triffin dilemma is not a theory. It is a description of mechanics. In 1960, an economist named Robert Triffin stood before the United States Congress. He explained why the system we were building would eventually destroy itself. They heard him, they understood him, and they did nothing. Because the flaw was not a bug. The flaw was the feature that made the whole architecture work. Here is the trap. For the dollar to function as the world's reserve currency, other nations must hold it. They must accumulate dollars to trade, to settle debts, to store value. But how do they get those dollars? America must send them out. The only way to send out more dollars than you take in is to run a trade deficit, buy more than you sell, import more than you export. This is not optional, it is structural. So we run deficits, year after year, decade after decade. The world needs dollars, we provide them. But deficits accumulate into debt, and debt accumulates into a number that eventually exceeds what anyone believes can be repaid. Today, that number is approximately $34 trillion. Not million, not billion, trillion. A figure so large, it has become meaningless, but its consequences are not meaningless. Did you know the United States has not had a trade surplus since 1975? That is, Robert Triffin saw this in 1960, before most Americans had credit cards, before Nixon closed the gold window, before the debt was measured in trillions. He saw the contradiction at the core. To maintain reserve currency status, you must undermine the foundation of that status. The privilege destroys itself, not through mismanagement, through its own operating logic. In 1971, President Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. He had no choice. Foreign nations held more dollars than America had gold to back them. The original Bretton Woods anchor was severed. From that moment forward, the dollar floated on nothing but trust. Trust that America would manage its debt responsibly. Trust that the currency would hold its value. That trust is now measurable, and it is declining. The moment gold disappeared from the equation, something fundamental shifted. The dollar became a promise with no collateral, a debt instrument backed only by future productivity. But the debt was growing faster than productivity. Every year, the gap widened. Every year, the promise became less believable. Not to ordinary Americans, we never thought about it, but to the central bankers, holding trillions in reserves. They noticed. They have always noticed. Can you name a single nation in history that accumulated debt at this rate and maintained currency dominance. I searched for one. I spent months looking for the exception, the empire that outran the math, the currency that survived its own contradictions. I could not find it, because it does not exist. The pattern is absolute. When debt exceeds productive capacity, trust erodes. When trust erodes, the currency weakens. When the currency weakens, the empire follows. The sequence has no exceptions. But here is what kept me awake. If the Triffin dilemma is mathematical certainty, why has the dollar survived this long? The British pound fell within 2 decades of reaching peak debt. The Dutch guilder collapsed faster. Yet the dollar has run deficits for nearly 50 years and still functions as the reserve. Something else was holding it up. Something beyond the math. I found 2 pillars. The first pillar was oil. In 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia reached an agreement. Saudi oil would be priced exclusively in dollars. In exchange, America would provide military protection. Every nation that needed oil now needed dollars first. This created artificial demand, a flaw under the currency that had nothing to do with American productivity, just the brute fact that energy required dollars. The second pillar was military enforcement, the largest military in human history. Bases in over 80 countries, naval presence in every ocean. The dollar was not just backed by trust, it was backed by the implicit understanding that challenging the system had consequences. Nations that attempted to price oil outside the dollar faced pressure, sometimes economic, sometimes political, sometimes military. The architecture was not invisible. It was simply unspoken. What happens to your purchasing power when the entity backing your currency owes more than it can ever repay? I thought these pillars were permanent. I thought oil would always require dollars. I thought military dominance would always enforce compliance. I was wrong. Both pillars are now cracking. The nations that once needed the dollar are building something else, a bypass system, a way to trade without American permission. And every sanction, every asset freeze, every weaponization of the financial system accelerates their timeline. We are not just watching the decay, we are causing it. The cracking began where I least expected, not in some distant rival nation, not in an economic collapse overseas. It began in Washington, in the policy decisions made by people who believed the dollar's power was unlimited. They used the currency as a weapon, and in doing so, they taught the world exactly why that weapon must be disarmed. In February 2022, the United States froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. Overnight, without warning, assets that Russia held in Western banks simply stopped being accessible. This was presented as punishment, as justice, as the cost of aggression. But every central banker in the world watched this moment with different eyes. They saw something else entirely. They saw the blueprint of their own vulnerability. I want you to understand what this meant. For decades, nations held dollar reserves because they were safe, untouchable, beyond politics. A central bank in Brazil or India or Saudi Arabia could hold billions in treasury bonds, knowing those assets would be there when needed. That assumption died in February 2022. The dollar did not stop being powerful. It stopped being neutral. And neutrality was the entire foundation. If you were a foreign central bank, would you hold reserves in a currency that could be frozen by political decision? The answer is already measurable. Since 2022, central banks have accelerated their diversification away from dollar holdings. They are not making announcements. They are making purchases. Gold, yuan, anything that cannot be frozen by a government in Washington. The data is not hidden. It is published quarterly, and the trajectory is unmistakable. Every sanction creates new converts to de-dollarization. Here is the trap I could not see until I saw it. The dollar's power as a weapon depends entirely on its necessity. Nations must need it. They must have no alternative. The moment alternatives exist, every use of the weapon accelerates the search for those alternatives. We are not defending the dollar when we weaponize it. We are advertising why escape is urgent. BRICS was an acronym I ignored for years. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It sounded like an academic conference, a talking shop for nations with grievances, but no real power. I was measuring power incorrectly. I was looking at military budgets. I should have been looking at population, at resources, at the share of global production that exists outside the dollar system. In 2024, BRICS expanded. Iran joined, Egypt joined, Ethiopia joined, the United Arab Emirates joined, and Saudi Arabia, the nation whose 1974 agreement created the petrodollar, the pillar that held the entire structure upright for 50 years. They are now sitting at the table, with nations explicitly building alternatives to dollar dominance. This is not a hypothetical future. This is the present configuration. Do you understand why Saudi Arabia is now considering yuan payment for Chinese oil purchases? The answer is simple once you see the numbers. China is Saudi Arabia's largest oil customer, has been for years. Why should that transaction require dollars? What service does the dollar provide? The dollar is a middleman taking a cut from every exchange. The moment that middleman becomes a threat, the moment reserves can be frozen, the middleman becomes a liability, not an asset, a risk to be eliminated. Over 40% of global oil is now traded outside the dollar. In 2000, that number was near zero. The petrodollar system is not collapsing in some dramatic crash. It is eroding, barrel by barrel, transaction by transaction. Each bilateral agreement between China and a resource nation is a small crack in the foundation. None of them alone is fatal. Together, they are a structural shift that cannot be reversed. China and Russia now settle their bilateral trade entirely in yuan and rubles, no dollars involved. The largest energy exporter and the largest energy importer on Earth conduct business without American permission, without American visibility, without American leverage. I thought this was impossible a decade ago. The architecture did not allow it. Then they built new architecture. When the largest oil exporters stop requiring dollars, what happens to dollar demand? This is not a rhetorical question. It has a mathematical answer. Dollar demand drops. When demand drops, value drops. When value drops, your purchasing power drops. Not because of anything you did, not because of any choice you made, because the structure underneath your savings shifted while you were not watching. The nations that once needed your currency decided they no longer did. I used to think the dollar was different from the pound and the guilder. I believed our military would enforce compliance indefinitely. I believed oil would always require dollars. I believed the architecture was permanent. But the 2022 sanctions taught me what they taught every central banker on Earth. The dollar is not a neutral asset. It is a conditional permission slip, and permissions can be revoked. The question was never whether nations would seek alternatives. The question was whether they could build them. And while I was watching cable news debates about inflation and interest rates, they were building, quietly, systematically, payment systems that bypass SWIFT, trade settlements in local currencies, gold purchases at historic levels, the infrastructure of a post-dollar world. Not theoretical, operational, expanding. The transition is not coming. The transition is underway. The only question now is whether you will recognize it before your wealth is repositioned, without your consent, without your awareness. The nations that hold American debt are making decisions right now. They are not asking permission. They are not issuing warnings. They are simply moving. And when enough of them move, the floor disappears. Not someday. On a timeline measured in years, not generations. The floor is already shifting. You can feel it if you know where to look. Not in the headlines, not in the official statements, in the quiet movements of central banks, in the bilateral agreements signed without fanfare, in the gold purchases that no one discusses on financial television. The repositioning is happening now. The only question is whether your wealth is part of the transfer or protected from it. I want to show you what happened to British citizens during the pound's decline. Not the geopolitics, not the empire's fall, the household reality. In the 1920s and 1930s, as sterling lost its reserve status, British purchasing power collapsed. The pound lost approximately 80% of its value over the transition period. Savings built over lifetimes evaporated. Pensions became worthless. The middle class watched everything they had accumulated become a fraction of what it once bought. They did not vote for this. They did not make bad decisions. They simply held their wealth in the wrong currency at the wrong moment in history. They trusted the system they were born into. That trust was the mechanism of their impoverishment. The wealth did not disappear. It transferred to those holding the rising currency, to those who saw the pattern before the pattern was obvious. What percentage of your net worth exists outside dollar-denominated assets? I asked myself this question 2 years ago. The answer terrified me. Over 65% of American household wealth is held in dollar-denominated assets, retirement accounts, home equity, savings accounts, stocks in American companies, bonds issued by the American government. We call this diversification. We spread our money across asset classes, stocks and bonds and real estate, but every single one is measured in dollars, priced in dollars, dependent on dollar stability. This is not diversification. This is concentration. Total exposure disguised as prudent planning. When the dollar weakens, every one of those assets weakens with it. Your stock portfolio does not protect you. It is priced in dollars. Your home equity does not protect you. It is measured in dollars. Your retirement account does not protect you. Every share, every bond, every fund inside it exists within the dollar system. You have diversified your positions. You have not diversified your currency risk. And currency risk is the only risk that matters during a reserve transition. In 2023, central banks around the world purchased over 1,000 metric tons of gold. This was the highest level since 1967. These are not conspiracy theorists. These are the institutions that manage national wealth. They are not talking about de-dollarization on television. They are executing it in their vaults, quietly, systematically, while telling their populations that everything is stable. The actions and the words do not match. I learned to watch the actions. Do you have a plan for preserving purchasing power during a reserve currency transition. BRICS is not building a replacement currency. I misunderstood this for months. They are building something more dangerous, a bypass system, a network of bilateral trade agreements that do not require dollar intermediation. China pays Russia in yuan. Russia pays India in rubles. Saudi Arabia considers yuan for oil. Each agreement is a thread in a web that excludes the dollar entirely. They do not need to replace the dollar. They just need to stop needing it. The system is already operational, not planned, not proposed, functioning. Trade is flowing between nations without touching the dollar. Every new agreement expands the network. Every sanction accelerates adoption. The infrastructure we thought would take decades to build is already carrying transactions. The post-dollar architecture is not a blueprint. It is a live system processing billions in trade, and it is growing faster than any official projection anticipated. Here is the trap I cannot escape. Neither can you. When reserve currency status erodes, the issuing nation faces two paths: default on the debt or inflate it away. There is no third option. Default is politically impossible. No government will declare it cannot pay. So they print. The Federal Reserve creates dollars, more and more dollars. Each new dollar dilutes the value of every dollar you hold. Your savings are not confiscated. They are diluted. The effect is identical. The mechanism is invisible. Inflation is not a policy failure. It is the policy. The only way to manage $34 trillion in debt is to make each dollar worth less. Pay back expensive debt with cheap currency. This works for the government. It devastates anyone holding that currency. Your retirement account may show the same number, but that number purchases less every year. The transfer is silent, legal, continuous. You are being made poorer in a way that never appears on any statement. When the history of this era is written, will you be among those who saw it coming? I think about the British pensioner in 1945. They trusted the pound. They trusted the empire. They trusted the institutions that had functioned their entire lives. And they watched their savings become worthless while the world moved to dollars. They were not stupid. They were not careless. They simply could not see the pattern while living inside it. They were too close, too invested in believing the system would hold. The system did not hold. It never does. The pattern is not complicated. Reserve currencies rise with empires. They fall with empires. The currency does not survive the transition. The population holding that currency pays the cost. Every time, without exception. The Dutch paid, the British paid, the Romans paid. The question is whether Americans will pay. The answer is already determined. The only variable is who among us will recognize it in time. I am not telling you what to do. I am not qualified to give financial advice. I am showing you a pattern that has repeated for 5 centuries. I am showing you the mechanism that makes the pattern inevitable. I am showing you that the transition is not theoretical. It is measurable. It is accelerating. And your wealth is positioned directly in its path. The transfer has already begun. It does not require your awareness. It does not require your consent. The only variable is whether you become the source of the transfer, or whether you recognize the pattern in time. Every empire believed its currency was different. Every population paid for that belief. The question was never if. The question was when. And whether you would see it. Before your wealth was transferred. To those who did,